Everyone loves a good clickbait article. You know those posts with titles like "Shocking Discovery of Huge Ancient UFO" or "You won't believe what this man did to his wife." Today we're talking about clickbait. Not everyone agrees that it's a bad thing. Clickbait headlines are misleading. This is pretty self-explanatory. Titles like "You won't unbelieve what this man did to his wife" imply that we're about to read a story with an incredible narrative, but instead we're met with a couple of paragraphs about some mundane reality. For those of you who don't know, Roblox is a massively popular online game creation platform for children. We've established that clickbait articles often don't live up to their titles, but does that really show that people are being manipulated? After all, it's not like the authors of these articles are forcing anyone to click on them. People read clickbait voluntarily. They choose to do it. Therefore, they must want to. And that's the problem. As I mentioned earlier, we tend to trust content more when it comes from sources we recognize. And chances are that the teacher in this scenario recognizes the name of the website that the article was posted on. If it's a popular site like BuzzFeed or Business Insider, then the teacher might not even think twice about clicking on the article. He'll just assume that the content is going to be good. Well, maybe. But it is also possible that people are choosing to click on these headlines without realizing that they're redoing it. So if our teacher is already a member of the church, then he'll probably assume that the author's decision to leave the church was caused by something negative. Even if the article doesn't explicitly say anything bad about the church, the teacher will fill in the blanks for him. Of course, the author had to leave the church. There must be some horrible things going on inside that building. And Robux is the virtual currency used within the platform. But in the process, the teacher was tricked into reading something he didn't want to read, and that's manipulation. That this type of manipulation isn't really a problem, because people can always choose to stop reading the article once they realize they've been tricked. But this argument ignores the fact that a lot of people don't do that. A lot of people will read the entire article, even if they're angry about it, and that's probably because of something called loss aversion. Basically, we hate throwing away time more than we love gaining time. So if we spend 5 minutes reading an article, we'll probably want to make sure that those 5 minutes weren't wasted, even if it means slogging through the rest of a boring article. So naturally, anyone looking after their kids' welfare would be interested in reading an article telling them how they could get free Robux for their kids. Clickbait articles might not be illegal, but that doesn't mean they're ethical. And while it's true that people can always stop reading them once they realize they're being tricked, that doesn't make it any less deceptive. But when they clicked on the link and started reading, they quickly realized that the article wasn't about how to get free Robux. It was about how to scam other players out of their Robux. We clicked because we wanted drama, but instead we got daily life. In 2017, researchers at the University of Cambridge published a paper arguing that online users often make decisions based on algorithms rather than conscious thought. The researchers cited a number of studies showing that people are more likely to click on things that are presented to them multiple times, even if they consciously believe that they don't like those things. Essentially, they argued that repetition tricks our brains into thinking something is more important than it actually is. In fact, there are some people who would argue that clickbait isn't necessarily a problem as long as it's done well. And finally, in 2020, let's go back to the example of the teacher who wrote a blog post about leaving the Mormon church. Now let's imagine that the title of his article didn't say anything about the church at all. Let's imagine that it simply said, "I decided to do something big." Now, if our teacher came across this article on his Facebook feed, he might not think much of it. He might think, interesting. But whatever. But then what if the same article popped up again the next day? Maybe it was shared by one of his friends, or it showed up in his news feed again. At this point, he might start wondering what this mysterious thing is that the author decided to do. Curiosity gets the better of him and he decides to click. Researchers from the University of Michigan found that people tend to interpret ambiguous words in ways that confirm their existing beliefs. It said that clickbait headlines manipulated our perception. Then the question becomes, how is it working? The title implied that Rinaldi had conducted research on the topic and discovered some hard facts about what men really want. In reality, however, the article was based entirely on her own opinion. She hadn't done any studies or gathered any data. She had just written down some thoughts she had about marriage and then put the post on the internet. How do these headlines trick us into clicking? To answer that, let's start with a few examples from real life. In 2013, a teacher named Andrew Sullivan posted a blog called "Why I Left the Mormon Church." The title promised an insightful on the inner workings of the Mormon faith, but instead the post was about Sullivan's personal decision to stop being a member of the church. While the two topics may seem similar, they aren't. Discussing your choice to leave the church is very different from writing an on it. One is a personal story. The other is an investigative piece. Now, if you were listening closely, you may have noticed that I didn't say anything about the contents of the articles themselves. I only talked about the titles. And that's important because while it's true that many of us feel manipulated when we realize we've been tricked into reading yet another boring listicle about some lady who had a baby in 1985 and then died 3 days later, that feeling isn't caused by the text in the article. Instead, it's caused by the discrepancy between the promise of the title and the delivery of the post. They might argue that if a reader clicks on an article because the title intrigued them, and they enjoy the content that they find once they get there, then it's all above board. Unfortunately, though, most clickbait falls into a bit of a grey area, where it's not always obvious whether or not a reader will be satisfied by the content they're clicking on. And it's in this grey area where things start getting a little dicey. But before we dive into the dark side of it, we need to get some basic terminology out of the way so we can all be on the same page. First off, when we say we mean articles that use sensationalized headlines to lure readers in with the promise of some sort of juicy story or information, but then deliver little to no substance once you actually get to the post itself. These types of articles are often designed to frustrate readers, leave them feeling like they've wasted their time or worse, to anger them enough that they'll immediately jump to the comments section to denounce the article and its author. We all read them even though we know that once we click, we're probably going to be disappointed. But why? Why do these headlines keep popping up and why do we keep falling for them? And most importantly, why do they usually disappoint? Well, there are a few reasons for each of those questions, but today I want to focus on just one reason. One reason that goes beyond simple internet psychology. One reason that shows how this style of headline has become such a pervasive part of our online experience. That reason is deception. Now, while many people have come to accept that clickbait exists and is here to stay, let's look at the first claim I made in this episode's title. The second claim in the title was a little more complex. So, if the manipulation is happening before we even read the article, in 2014, a woman named Karen Rinaldi wrote an article called "What Every Husband Wants His Wife to Know." In 2016, a writer named Billie Eilish wrote a blog post titled "How to Get Free Robux." Okay, great. To understand how that's possible, let's take a look at a few studies. Another study from 2019 found that people tend to trust content more when it comes from sources they recognize, even if those sources aren't particularly credible. When you combine these three cognitive biases, you get a perfect storm for clickbait. But when he reads the article and realizes that it's not about a crazy adventure or a life-changing event, he'll probably feel angry and manipulated. Finally, We need to remember that people tend to interpret ambiguous words in ways that confirm their existing beliefs. So in the end, the teacher ends up reading an article he never would have read otherwise, which means that the author's purpose was achieved. Now, some people might argue, ultimately, clickbait thrives in the grey area between honesty and deception. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and leave a comment telling me what you thought.